what he would do is he would drive around in his car. He'd see a co-ed hitchhiking. Say, "Where are you going?" And she'd tell him, and he'd look at his watch and say, "Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I have time to take you there. Um, all right, get in. I'll take you there." And that disarmed the potential victim, so she'd get in with him, and then she was his. And this is, as you said, Craig, this is a classic case of displacement. He worked his way up, killing enough of these co-eds until he had a sense that he had accomplished and possessed them as he never could have in normal life. And then he killed his mother. He bludgeoned her to death in her bed, and then took
with
off
a claw hammer, right?
With a claw hammer, and ripped out her larynx so that she could never yell at him again, threw it down the garbage disposal in the kitchen,
Wow.
and the garbage disposal threw it back out again. He said, "See, she's still getting to me." And what's very, very interesting about Ed Kemper, as opposed to almost any other serial killer we've studied, is that he drove quite a ways away from Santa Cruz, I believe to Las Vegas or somewhere in Nevada. He picked up the phone at a phone booth and called the Santa Cruz police and said, "It's me. I've done it. Come and get me."
To understand how Mark Olshaker came to know that story this well, and dozens like it, we have to go back to the moment he walked into Quantico with a film crew and met the man who changed criminal investigation forever.
Well, Mark, on these episodes, we try to talk to all types of people in law enforcement.
Sure.
We call it heroes behind the badge because we talk to a lot of people who've done heroic things. We've talked to people.
And just Dennis, I follow Craig's posts on Facebook too.
Okay,
So
good. So you're familiar. But today, I am delighted that we have somebody who not only knows about some of the biggest cases that we've ever heard of, but knows a little bit about the background of some of these serial offenders that everybody, their household words. Everybody knows their name, unfortunately. So I'm fascinated, and I think our listeners and audience will be fascinated by what you have to say, because your background, you teamed up with a guy named John Douglas at some point. Tell us a little bit about who is John Douglas, and why was John Douglas important to you in your work?
Well, the way it all started was I am a novelist and documentary filmmaker and nonfiction author by trade. I was writing and producing films for Nova, the PBS science series.
Yes.
And I had read, as many of us had, Tom Harris's books, Red Dragon and the Silence of the Lambs. And after I finished Silence of the Lambs, I called Paula Upsell, the executive producer of Nova at WGBH in Boston. And I said, "Paula, this book is really good, and I understand they're making a movie out of it. And if the movie is anywhere near as good as the book, I think it's going to be a big hit." Of course, I had no idea how big a hit it would be. And I said, "Look, why don't we go to Quantico, the FBI Academy?" And I met this man named John Douglas, who was the unit chief. And the more I learned about him, the more I knew that he was kind of a living legend within the police and law enforcement community for having really been the pioneer of behavioral science and criminal investigative analysis as the FBI was starting to practice. And John Douglas had become he had spent two stints as a street agent, one in Milwaukee and one in Detroit, where he learned a lot about criminal behavior just observing the people that they were arresting.
Sure.
And the time he got to Quantico, he and another agent named Bob Ressler, were assigned to what they called road schools, which was they would go out for 2 weeks at a time and teach 1 week each to local law enforcement agencies and kind of give them a uh, kind of a superficial but fairly in-depth orientation to what they were teaching in the behavioral science unit at Quantico. And John had the idea that, as he said, you can only drink so many margaritas and hang out in the hotel so long. So he said, as long as we're on the road, let's go into the prisons, the penitentiaries of the places where we are, and just see if we flash our FBI badges, if we can get to talk to some of these offenders. But what they were able to do by being very prepared, by studying the case files ahead of time so that these guys couldn't say anything that wasn't really true or that spin it in their own way, was they were able, by talking to these people, by finding out what was going on in the minds of these offenders, violent offenders, predatory offenders, to claim what was going on in the offender's mind before, during, and after the offense, what was going on between the offender and the victim. Right. Therefore, by having this, for the first time, profound understanding of what the criminal was like, they could start to profile them and figure out what it was that that the police should be looking for. And let me just say one thing. John has said in the beginning, profiling does not catch criminals. Profiling helps the local police or local investigators narrow their search, focus their investigation. They're the ones who catch the criminals. So in any event, so we started interviewing them. They let us go through all their case files. We came up with some cases that we thought were interesting. We followed them up, and we ended up with a film called Mind of a Serial Killer, which was nominated for a national Emmy. And the first time it was on PBS, it got quite good ratings. And the behavioral science unit, and specifically the investigative support unit, started getting a lot more requests from local law enforcement.
I'm sure.
And so it was altogether a very positive experience. We're very proud of that film, even to this day. And then I would say several months later, John called me and he said, I'm getting ready to retire from the Bureau. And do you think anybody would be interested in my story? And if they are, would you be interested in writing me? And I kind of immediately said yes and yes. And so let's see. And so called my agent. He encouraged me to write a proposal, which in a sense was, okay, this is the real story behind Silence of the Lambs. And John Douglas is the character that the Scott Glenn character in the movie is really based on. And Scott said very often that John was the one who really taught him, how to be an FBI agent.
Wow.
And so he worked with Jodie Foster when they were doing the film. And so we went to New York, talked to a number of publishers, got several offers, and out of that came this memoir, history of profiling, if you will, which probably one of my most important contributions was somehow to come up with the name Mindhunter, which really stuck. And
love the name. Craig, you have it there, don't you? Yeah, look at this.
I just wanted to hold this up.
There you are.
And Dennis and Bill, I think I've told you in the past, but Mark Olshaker, when I did a radio show years ago here in the DC area, he was my favorite guest I ever interviewed, and I never forgot Mark. And Mark became a great supporter of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and the museum that we were building. And I had to have him back as a guest on our show today.
Absolutely.
And we'll probably have him back because this guy is full of stories and of great interest to law enforcement and to the average person.
looking at his profile, my gosh, we could do a whole series of interviews here. But for today, I think
Craig, you've already profiled me, Dave. Yes.
Yes, I have profiled you, sir. Not as good as John Douglas could have probably done it, but in my own little way. But Craig, I know that you have a particular admiration for Mark and for his work. Why don't you lead us off? What do you think our audience would like to know that's inside Mark's book and inside Mark's documentary, but inside his brain? What do you think people want to hear?
And let me just say, Dennis, that Mindhunter did well enough that we just continued. We did a second book called Journey into Darkness, and we have done a bunch of books over the years, probably 10 altogether. We did one called The Cases That Haunt Us, which talks about prominent murder cases throughout history, beginning with Jack the Ripper and ending with the John Benet Ramsey case, talking about, okay, what can we tell people about this from investigating it from a behavioral standpoint?
Absolutely. Craig, why don't you've got a good handle on all this.
Well, first of all, Mark, I'm interested myself. Who was the first serial killer? Was it Jack the Ripper? What was the first serial killer here in the United States? Who was that?
Well, it's a very, very interesting question, because we generally talk about the modern era of serial killers, beginning with Jack the Ripper in the East End of London in the spring, summer, and fall of 1888. But it's probably true that there were serial killers long before that. Probably things that we attributed to werewolves or witches or whatever throughout European history probably were early serial killers. We can't prove that, but it's logical. It makes sense. So we start in terms of our analysis with Jack the Ripper, and as I said in our book, The Cases That Haunt Us, we take a stab at who we think Jack the Ripper really was. And one of the things I found out when I was doing research on the case at Scotland Yard in London is I firmly believe that the Metropolitan and the City Police, the two police forces in London at the time and to this day, a pretty good idea of who it was, in spite of the fact that it's never been revealed.
Interesting. Okay, so there's a question that I think you address in the book Mindhunter, and that is, are serial killers born to be serial killers, or are they manufactured? In other words, does the way they were treated by their mother, their father, something in their life that triggered this rage and forced them to go out and kill people? I'm just fascinated by that. Like Ed Kemper, for example, a huge guy, I think 6'8", whatever, and his mother treated him as if he were a monster, and made him feel that way his entire life. And women, his mother told him women would never be interested in dating you, so why even bother? That was the way he was treated, and he hated his mother. But instead of killing his mother, he goes out and kills all these other women before he kills his mother. I mean, it's an amazing story of violence and just the most despicable criminal that perhaps we've ever known. And yet you, in the book, I think you and John talk about maybe he was manufactured. Maybe he wasn't born with all this violence in his mind. What's your theory on that?
Well, Craig, I think you've hit on probably the most fundamental issue in the entire study of violent predators, which is, are they made or are they born? Nurture or nature? And the answer, again, it's generally almost always a combination. There's probably something hardwired into these people that makes them impulsive. It makes them violent if they're frustrated and all that. And yet, at the same time, we have seen very few of these guys, and they're almost always guys, by the way. We can talk about that later if you want, who do not have some kind of a bad background. And Ed Kemper is the perfect example. Usually they are either abused, they are neglected, they are abandoned, they come from abject poverty. There's usually something really bad in their background. And so what they grow up with is this resentment, this anger. And at the same time, because of what they've been through, this feeling of entitlement that the laws of society don't apply to me. And some of them develop, as we've talked about, a sense of grandiosity as a result. But that sense of grandiosity is at war with this deep-seated feeling of inadequacy that they have. And then that's triangulated with this feeling that I've talked about resentment about society for not giving them what they wanted and what they thought they were entitled to, and the regular laws don't apply to them. Now, Ed Kemper is a perfect example of that because he was a big guy. He was felt very impotent growing up because of his mother. His mother couldn't handle him, sent him off to his grandparents. He eventually murdered his grandparents. He actually
At
liked
a
his
young age, right? I think
at
he
a
was
very
only
young
14.
teenager, yeah, and living on their farm. He actually liked his grandfather, but once he'd killed his grandmother, he felt he had to kill him to cover up the crime. Obviously, the crime was not covered up. He was institutionalized for a while, sent back to his mother, who, as you said, Craig, always said he was inadequate. He would never make it with girls. She felt he was dangerous to his sister. She essentially had him sleep in the basement next to the furnace and locked him in there. Now, this obviously created a tremendous amount of resentment. And what he did was classic displacement. When he became able to do so, he started. His mother worked at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and he started killing young, beautiful co-eds at the Santa Cruz community to get back at his mother and say, "See, I can control them." And he was a very smart, intelligent guy and very cunning. I mean, one of the most uh, chilling things about him was, I remember he went to a court-appointed or psychiatrist appointment. Psychiatrist said he was doing quite well. He had the head of one of his victims in the trunk of his car at that time. He was also very, very smart. Um, he would his MO, his modus operandi, and we can make a distinction between MO and signature. Modus operandi is what you have to do to commit the crime. Signature is what you have to do to make it emotionally satisfying for you. So MO is the way he got to get to these co-eds and rape them and kill them. And signature is what he did to them, uh, which was emotionally satisfying to him. So they had the local police check him out. And so, as I was saying, as far as I know, he's the only one who, once he'd gotten out of his system, he turned himself in.
Right.
And he's still in prison after all these years, after all these decades. And last I heard, he was not interested in parole. He didn't think that he would do well in the outside world. And what he spends a lot of his time doing now, he's got a very nice voice. What he spends a lot of his time doing is recording audiobooks for the blind.
Really?
Believe
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mark, here's what was amazing to me is that John Douglas going into these prisons, interviewing people like Ed Kemper, the worst of the worst.
Mhm.
And he actually, in the book, says, I found Ed Kemper rather likable. He had a
Yeah.
sense of humor. And I just can't, fathom that given the violence, given
Yeah.
the depraved nature of this man. I mean, how do you,
Well,
justify that?
certainly you can't justify or excuse any of his crimes, but I think John felt a certain degree of sympathy and empathy for him because he's one of these people, despite the way he was hardwired. If he'd had a different upbringing, if he'd had some support, if he'd had some encouragement from his mother, um, he might not have turned out that way. Which
And that's the point I want to jump in about right now is
Yeah.
because, you know, during my time as a cop, and you'd handle all these kind of different violent incidents and whatnot, and you'd look at this guy that you just locked up, and you're thinking, wow, this guy's, you know, out of his freaking mind. And then you
which to a
go and
certain
you'd see,
extent he is, Bill.
yeah,
No doubt.
but then my point is, based on what we're talking about his mother, then you'd go to these people's houses and you'd look at the family and you'd look at the parents and you'd say, no wonder this guy's fucking nuts, because she's nuts, right?
Yes.
And so clearly, I mean, I'm sure as you've written your books and you've done these backgrounds and investigations, I'm sure that this woman, I mean, just based on what we've just spoken about how she treated her son rather, growing up, she must have been nuts. And that's just kind of, you know, it's like a chip off the old block.
Yeah. In fact, Bill, when we did the first book, my mother, who was a school teacher and then sort of in mid-career went to law school and became a lawyer, after she read Mindhunter, she came to John and me and said, "So it's always the mother, isn't it?" and I said, "Not always, Mom. But,
Mostly."
I said, that can have a lot to do with it. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I got to tell you, we've got a few things in common, for sure. And as you've stated, you did some documentary films, and I did some documentary films. But more importantly, is not too long ago, I was contacted by a British producer over in London about Sam Little, and I'm sure you know about Sam Little. You know, he is responsible. Well, he confessed at least to 90 murders to a Texas state ranger, who is referred to as the serial killer whisperer. And they did do a show about that, and we wanted to do a documentary about it, or this producer in Britain wanted to do a show. So this guy, Sam Little, was pretty interesting because, you know, everybody has different motivational things. And the case you just talked about was more than likely, you know, this guy's mother wrecked him and made him feel so insignificant and impotent and any number of things like you described, and created that. This guy, Sam Little, though, he was a different type of serial killer. And I remember, because we spoke to the Texas Ranger who debriefed him and sat for hours, you know, talking to him about these cases. And he would show Sam pictures of the victims that he killed. And right away he would get excited. And
I think I know where you're going with it.
You know where I'm going with this, right? Because you've heard this. And he would get sexually aroused over this. So that's a whole different ball game. Maybe you can expound.
Yeah, but I think you brought up a very, very important point, Bill, which is that, as John says, if you catch these guys, which you want to, because you want to get them off the street as quickly as possible,
Of course,
you can lock up the body, but you can't lock up the mind. One of the reasons probably that a lot of these predators were willing to talk to John and Bob is they wanted to relive the crimes. You take somebody like Dennis Rader, the BTK strangler, who terrorized Wichita, Kansas for decades at a time. He's in prison for the rest of his life. I would be willing to bet that he spends his nights reminiscing and reliving each of his cases.
Wow.
Each of his murders, which he called his products, which John always said, you want to understand the artist, look at the art. And in this case, I'm not exaggerating. In a lot of these cases, this is their art. This is what's most important to them. And Craig and I have talked about the fact, are these serial killers who get away with it, are they brilliant? You know, are they able to evade law enforcement? Well, first of all, thank God there's no Hannibal Lecters out there. That's a complete myth.
Well, let's say at least none that we know of.
None that we know of. But
could be Dennis, though. You know,
Never know the guy next to you, right, Mark?
Although let me just tangentially say that John said, with all that he knows about getting away with murder, there's no way he could do it. He said, everybody's got some kind of, vulnerability.
Some kind of tell,
whether it's the post-offense behavior. I said, what would be in your case? He said, I don't have to go into murder. He said, he said, I was not the most exacting lot of ways. He said, you put in the FBI, you put an expense report in front of me and I'll start to sweat. What have they found that I've gotten wrong? So there's always
guilt.
Like
Yeah,
that.
That's funny.
I have an interesting question, though, Mark, because we talk about a lot of these serial killers, and most of them are historical, right? I mean, they go back years ago.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about today? I mean, you just don't hear about these prolific serial killers or serial criminals today like you did in the past, and it's my belief that it's just because you just can't get away with that anymore. There's a video camera on every corner.
Yep.
Every vehicle has a black box in it, like an airplane now. You can track everybody by their cell phones. I just think it's just not as likely or as possible as it was back in the day.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, we have a lot more law enforcement modalities to work with, and of course, DNA has been a major issue because if you've got DNA, and look, a lot of crimes you don't have, as you know from your own experience, Billy, you don't have all that kind of physical evidence. There's what they call the CSI effect in juries, where because CSI gets all kinds of scientific evidence, juries expect you to have it. You don't always get it, but in the case of sex crimes and these kind of predatory murders, very often there is DNA or something like that you can work with and use. So I think you're right. I think you don't have as many of these dramatic, extended, long-term, excuse me, serial cases. Look, even in the case of BTK, they got him on a computer disk, something that didn't exist to begin with when he first started his crime spree.
Mark Olshaker has spent 30 years inside the minds of the worst predators in American history. Next time, we go deeper into the man who hid a serial killer behind a church pulpit. The question of whether these monsters can ever be predicted, and the case that Mark says was never going to end well.